Good morning and welcome to the second session on the topic of Can Restorative Justice Address Corruption in Guatemala? My name is Carl Stauffer, Senior Expert for Reconciliation here at the USIP, and it's my pleasure to be able to moderate this distinguished panel that will be looking at the issue of applying restorative justice approaches to the dilemma and the challenge of corruption in Guatemala. United States Institute of Peace is a national, nonpartisan, independent institute founded by Congress and dedicated to the proposition that a world without conflict is possible, practical, and essential for U.S. and global security. The Institute works with local partners to prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict. It's a real pleasure to have each one of you here, and I want to also remind you that there are translation services, English to Spanish, Spanish to English, so feel free to pick up the headphones and translations. We'll be using both languages back and forth in this panel. I want to frame this panel as we go into the very practice of what does restorative justice and a restorative justice response to corruption look like. I want to frame this a little bit around corruption as a structural violence. We often reduce it to a personal moral narrative or an issue of economic activity, but it's beyond that, and I would like to make the argument that it is, in fact, a structural violence. From a systems perspective, corruption has many driving factors and characteristic elements that place it in the category of structural violence. Corruption, like endemic violence, may be better understood as a public health issue. It is a social, political, and economic disease whose destructive legacies and aftermaths are pandemic in proportions and nature. The foundation of this conversation, it is incumbent on us to acknowledge that corruption is one of the outgrowths of widespread poverty and inequality around the globe. It represents a legacy of a yawning gap between the rich and the poor, plaguing most countries worldwide. One can say that corruption is like often the ignored, unwanted child of a dominant global economic system that is built on many inequalities. But I want to say the aftermaths of corruption are what we're looking at, and how do we mitigate those aftermaths? They're multiple, these aftermaths. Corruption fails to acknowledge, first of all, the value and the needs of the common good. It elevates competition and diminishes cooperation. Secondly, corruption works off of a deficit mentality, promoting a worldview that focuses on the ideas of limited pie resources and zero-sum game theories. Third, corruption feeds off of power asymmetry and thereby inadequately nurtures and legitimizes hierarchy, patrimony, and dependency. And finally, corruption enforces a pseudo-collaboration, convincing people that participation in a corrupt system is the only way to personally survive and even to preserve societal order. We are deceived into believing that without consenting to corruption, there would be social, political, and economic chaos. So what can we do? We have been exploring multiple approaches to figure out how do we mitigate the issue of corruption. And this session will examine whether and how restorative justice mechanisms can be used to hold corrupt actors accountable while repairing the harm caused to vulnerable communities. Legal and human rights experts will discuss the theory and practice of restorative justice, the challenges of applying these mechanisms to economic crimes, and the use of negotiation and dialogue to foster reconciliation, and the provision of remedies for the victims of corruption, especially poor communities deprived of vital public services and often the most affected by systems of corruption. So I have a great panel here. I'm not going to take any more time on the introductory remarks, and I will introduce them briefly and then turn it over. We have 3 panelists here in person, and we have 1 online. Let me just introduce them briefly, and then I'll be turning the time over to them to give their presentations. To my immediate left is Dr. Jennifer Llewellyn. She will be starting off our presentation on restorative justice approaches to Corruption. Jennifer Llewellyn is a professor at Dalhousie University in the School of Law. This is in Nova Scotia, Canada. She's a professor of law and a director of the Restorative Research, Innovation, and Education Lab. She has decades of experience in restorative justice and its application in multiple transitional processes, transitional justice processes, and she'll be speaking to the broader universal look at what does restorative justice bring to the mitigation of corruption. Then we will be going online with Dr. Fanie du Toit, a good colleague and friend. Fanie du Toit is a former executive director of the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in Cape Town, South Africa. He has supported reconciliation efforts in Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, and he's also renowned for his work in reconciliation and transitional justice across the world. I had the privilege of working with Fanie du Toit in South Africa during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, so he's a good friend and colleague, and I'm really pleased he's taken the time to be with us today. Then to my next, on my left, Dr. Gabriel Rojas-Andrade. He's Director of Restorative Justice with USIP's office in Bogota, Colombia. And we work closely together, and he has brought a huge amount of wealth to his work from his experience, both as a lawyer, as a professor, as someone who has studied restorative justice and its applications, and he will be speaking to us around some of his experience and some possible learnings from the Colombian transitional process, specifically around macro case development and application. And finally, we'll have a respondent from Guatemala, and who will help us contextualize the comments that have come from many parts of the world. Daniel Haering, he's training coordinator in a organization called Dialogos, and he has a journalism and an international relations background. He's been a university professor and an advisor for public and private sectors. He's currently an advisor for the Guatemalan Corruption Commission. So, with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation and for being able to contribute to this really important conversation. I wanted to start at the outset by saying I think it's really helpful to be clear that restorative justice, especially in the way in which I think it is most important and helpful in this context, and the way in which I've used it and developed it in this context, offers much more than just tools or specific processes that are aimed at repairing or mitigating the harms of the past, or maybe put another way, as we understand those harms as you've described them, the mitigating the harms of structural violence requires us to be thinking and understanding the significant impact on trust and on changes in social structures. And so there is some impetus to not only address past harms or issues, but to think about the rebuilding of a just world. And so fully understood, I think it's important to consider restorative justice as a relational theory of justice that actually invites us to think relationally about justice, about the goal of justice, so what it looks and feels like, sort of framed around this idea of just relations that help us think not only about relationships in the sense of how people behave, how individuals interact with one another in these interpersonal ways, but indeed how we think about the relational environment, like what structures and incentivizes those behaviors and relationships through institutions, through systems, and through social structures. And so it is because, as Carl describes, the nature of the problem of corruption is in fact both cultural and this sort of idea of structural violence, that in fact my response to whether restorative justice has some contribution to make is maybe a bold and audacious one, which is to say not only can it make a useful contribution in responding to corruption, but that it's actually essential. And it's essential when we understand a restorative approach to justice to shift our understanding of what justice looks and feels like and requires, to keep pace with, to be responsive to the kind of complex relational structural nature of corruption as an issue. And so, of course, it offers us interesting and important processes and practices that can draw people into this work, but it can do that without having to choose between responding at an individual level or a structural level, but understanding the need to do both and to do both at once because of the nature of the issue of corruption. So in the short time I have here, I want to note sort of three key important ways, all of which warrant and further conversation and discussion, which I know will be expanded upon on this panel and beyond, but three ways in which a restorative approach to justice is well suited and indeed potentially essential to the ambitious work and commitments of the Commission in Guatemala as you take on your work to tackle corruption. The first is that it helps, this framing, this understanding of the work of justice, what's owed, what's required, helps us to frame the problem appropriately, right? As a relational way of understanding justice, it gives us the tools and the way to do an analysis of the nature of the problem and its impacts and its harms, a way to talk concretely about that, to understand that problem as a baseline foundation for addressing it. So it is not a move to just blame society to look relationally, but it does prove the inadequacy of blaming individuals without looking at the context, causes, and circumstances that structured the way they behave, why they behave that way, how they impact others when they behave that way, and to reveal that because that's where the work needs to be directed to move towards a more just way of working, right? An anti-corruption or one based in integrity, right, in the ways in which we work and operate. The second then significant contribution of restorative justice is that it's then once you see the issue that way, once you see it in its structural and cultural nature and in this relational way, you need to adapt and adopt processes and practices that are capable of working in that relational way, that are capable of calling people into those processes in non-adversarial ways, in ways that allow them to appreciate both the ways in which they've been harmed by corruption, but the responsibilities they hold for how they've participated, and doesn't require people to sit on one side or the other as either victims or offenders, but can call them into this work to share their perspective, their experience, and their responsibilities in more complex ways. So we actually have processes that can support people being called in to be part of solutions in ways that can hold that kind of complex truth about the fact that many people are both impacted by the pervasiveness of corruption and are implicated in it, but also have suffered harms and have roles in moving forward in a different way. And we have a range of examples of those restorative processes that have happened at the level of truth commissions, public inquiries, that have happened at state and national levels that are capable of working both at the local level and at that structural level to call people in to that truth-seeking, problem-solving, making plans that they're committed to executing and carrying out, because they build that commitment not only to the issue or to their responsibilities, but to one another, so that when they walk from those processes, they have a plan and a commitment to one another for how they're going to be and behave differently. And so that sort of solution finding. We have examples of that in my own home province in Nova Scotia, of a large systemic commission of inquiry into intergenerational institution for the care of colored, what was called the Home for Colored Children, of African Nova Scotian children over generations, that was deeply steeped in patterns of corruption related to systemic racism. And we're currently doing work in the Canadian military to shift the culture of sexual harassment and sexual misconduct, and to do that in a way that's trying to recover and shift that entire institution that's aligned with the kind of ambition that the Commission has. Finally, I think it's important to say that our restorative approach has another significant benefit to offer our work in anti-corruption, which is to not only be reactive to the harms and consequences of past corruption, but to be a supportive way of working within institutions to model and foster a different way forward. And that this isn't work that we just wait to do once we've tackled corruption, but as we are tackling the past incidences of corruption and the ways in which we need to understand that and move forward, we need to be building new pathways for the way institutions, organizations, and communities can work, can engage with one another. And a restorative approach has been used within institutions to foster the conditions for integrity, the conditions for not being corrupt, and modeling in practical and real lived terms every day, what does that require of us? How will we show up differently with one another? And so taking a restorative approach to assertively build a different culture on the day-to-day is important work to begin to seed and engage in as the Commission is doing its work to shift at structural levels the conditions for people to be able to show up differently. They have to start to build habits and patterns of showing up differently in schools across the country, in hospitals, in community halls. And so we have many examples of those in domestic settings that would be helpful to this ambition of the Commission in thinking about how a restorative approach is taken on the everyday in schools, in everything from classrooms to parent councils to city halls and budgeting. And that's a proactive use of thinking about how do we build the conditions and processes that can support just relations, how we show up with one another on the everyday in a different way.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, just giving that broader view, helping us think about how if we can center relationships, both in dealing with the past, as well as preventing corruption in the future, and using those same relational practices to build new institutions. Fabulous. Thank you very much. We're going to move forward with Dr. Fanie du Toit and invite him to come into this space and give us a case study from South Africa and how they have wrestled with this issue of corruption at multiple fronts. Fanie, over to you.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you and also to USIP. Thank you to Jennifer. I think that saves me saying a lot of things and give a very, very good framework just to place this case study into. And I thought of entitling it Public Truth in Social Reconstruction. The role of public truth in social reconstruction. If authorities fail, we vote them out. If we discover that they have no intention at all to succeed in the first place and play by their own rules, we too stop playing by the rules, and then it becomes a free for everyone. And as the fog of war is descending on us all internationally, corruption finds a very fertile breeding ground. Apologies if I'm going to stick very closely to my text, colleagues, because we have such limited time. But I would like to say that for us in South Africa, public truth, unvarnished public truth, has been essential to build civic trust. It was the big result out of our Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And most recently, we experienced another commission, the Zondo Commission, named after the judge that was in charge of this commission, Chief Justice Zondo, that focused exclusively on what we call state capture or corruption at large. I think it's important to say that under President Jacob Zuma's absolutely disastrous tenure as president, South Africans nearly stopped believing in our country. What Mandela had built up, Zuma very nearly destroyed. Nearly, but not quite. It was 7 December 2015, a day that none of us will forget, and state capture was in full swing. That day, our finance minister Nhlanhla Nene was fired abruptly by the president for failing to avail funds for transactions with Airbus and also with Russian nuclear provisions for nuclear power stations. Those were transactions we could not afford, and Nene refused to sign them off, and Jacob Zuma fired him immediately. That Friday, a new backbencher of the ANC, Des van Rooyen, was appointed Minister of Finance and walked into the Treasury with two people beside him. A previous finance minister, Trevor Manuel, wrote on Twitter, "Look who's beside him. Look who's beside him." And none of us understood that, but later on realized that those were two people directly delegated and part of the Gupta family business empire that was very close to Jacob Zuma. And it now became the two chief advisors to the finance minister as they marched into the treasury. That was the Friday. The Saturday evening, a business delegation went to see Jacob Zuma and explained to him what might happen to the country if Des van Rooyen was to A, remain finance minister, and B, sign off on those deals. On Monday, Jacob Zuma fired Des van Rooyen. And our third finance minister in 3 days or 4 days was appointed none other than Pravin Gordhan, who was a staunch anti-corruption fighter who recently died and who will go down in history as the face of the resistance against state corruption. We now call Des van Rooyen the weekend special because he was the finance minister for an entire weekend. The high-profile politicians, coordinated by the president, collided with corrupt business, both local and international, including very reputable international firms like Bain, like Airbus and others, to manipulate government procurement services at the top level, organize kickbacks payments to ministers in the cabinet, including the president, in exchange for turning a blind eye to non-delivery of contracts worth billions of rand. And as a direct result of that, our parastatals, which is our service provision quasi companies, partly or owned by the state, but running different essential services, all but collapsed. Road and rail, electricity provision, our airline, so-called airline, and many others. Our intelligence services were compromised. Our police service was compromised. And a spineless ANC parliament agreed to it all. In October 2016, though, one brave woman, the Public Protector of South Africa, Thuli Madonsela, published a report that she called State of Capture, in which she made allegations to the effect of the crimes I've just listed above. And it recommended a judicial inquiry to investigate these allegations. Subsequently, Justice Zondo was nominated, and immediately Jacob Zuma opposed this in court, but was defeated in the court, and Justice Zondo was appointed. And what followed was the most remarkable episode of public truth-telling since our Truth Commission. In a nutshell, as a result of this very highly publicized inquiry, I argue that some measure of national and international trust was restored in South Africa. Of course, Zuma was also removed and a largely credible president in his place, Ramaphosa, was appointed, who may have made mistakes, but again, his intentions are not in doubt. Zondo ran a remarkable process. He reminded us at the onset that if the whole agenda was to, or the whole mandate was to be meticulously followed, would take him 10 years to complete. But he did in 429 days of public hearings, all of which were televised and live streamed, and transcripts loaded onto the Commission website the same day. 300 witnesses, 1.7 million page report, and another petabyte, and I'm told that is many, many bytes of data, millions of pages also provided. And what he found was, A, that state capture, in fact, did occur in South Africa, that it was a project by a relatively small group of actors to redirect resources from state for their own gain. There was a deliberate effort to exploit and weaken key institutions. There were strategic appointments, the reorganization of procurement processes, undermining of oversight mechanisms, and manipulation of public narrative. And was not simply about extracting resources, and this is important in terms of corruption, but it was further geared towards securing future power and control over the political order. Since then, our president has strengthened our National Prosecuting Authority considerably, appointed a brilliant woman in charge. The report, Zondo Commission report, implicated 1,438 people. The president has installed a permanent anti-corruption unit within the NPA now. What is now on its way is a flawed, but not fundamentally flawed, prosecution process, where South Africans have begun to believe that the intention is there to prosecute these people, although the capacity is not yet there. And that's what I argue at the onset of this, the fundamental difference between having civic trust and not having it. We're not expecting our governments to be flawless. We expect them to have the intention to do what is good. And if we lose that faith, then civic trust is fundamentally undermined. We have some cases have started. Jacob Zuma's case itself will commence shortly. He was subpoenaed to the commission, went, made a joke of it, refused to go back, was subsequently imprisoned for contempt of court, and which precipitated riots across sections of KwaZulu-Natal, but we haven't flinched. This was the make or break moment for South Africa, and I believe the country has chosen the correct route through an remarkable exercise of public truth-telling. I do not think that amnesty is relevant here. I do not think that even reduced sentencing is relevant. I think in that sense, retributive justice is needed. But the idea of public truth-telling as an essential ingredient of restoring social relations has never been more important for us. I want to acknowledge and also express my solidarity with Guatemala and their efforts as a fellow country of the Global South. Your fight is our fight, and we will do everything we can to assist you in this process, and Godspeed. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that case study. Very, very important. And I just want to remind the folks that are here, we're going to be taking a break after this panel, and then we'll be diving deeper into some of these issues for an hour between 10:30 and 11:30. So we're hoping all of you can stay for that conversation, or as many as possible. We're going to move now to Gabriel in Colombia. Gabriel.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you to my colleagues in the panel. For those who are watching online and here, to my colleagues from the Commission Against Corruption in Guatemala. I'm going to switch to Spanish because I want to refer to my colleagues as it was just said of the global south, with the language I think better explains what I want to express, which is the lessons learned by Colombia, not only by the recent developments in transitional justice, but in the last 25 years, what we have learned about criminal investigation for massive violations of human rights, and how can that can be used in order to tackle corruption. Entonces, paso a español y lo que ven en la presentación.
I'd like to go to Spanish now. As we can see on our my presentation, I will be speaking about macro-criminal investigation, restorative practice, and transitional justice. Now, these are two different aspects that can be found in the Colombian model. The objective is to tackle the corruption through these mechanisms, which is, one of them is transitional justice. The goal is to look at those responsible for the conduct of control and find justice for millions of victims. Now, this is very profound, and the image you see on the screen is the Manual for Transitional Justice that we issued in May, and through USIP, we've been able to help review it and edit it, and we've been able to begin the translation, which will start this week. But what I'm really getting at is not really the processes of transitional justice, but also how to investigate when it's been years and thousands of victims and so many perpetrators. How can we get to that transitional justice? Because in the end, turning justice into transitional justice means implementing practices that are meant for local matters or individual people in a community, victims in a community, but also turning that into something that will serve millions of victims in different communities. So that's the main challenge. What is macrocriminality? Well, this is a concept that comes from Germany, and certainly this is due to what Germany became under the Nazi regime, which is macrocriminality, meaning punitive control of the state over the population. And a German author in 1991, Haering, refers to when power is used for a political purpose and a series of actions is carried out against the collective group. Now, when I refer to political power, it doesn't have to be a constitutional state. It can also be a guerrilla, for example, that has power over a region, or a cartel who exercises its power over a state, especially when it comes to justice and cultural matters and conflicts in an area. So this is what we've seen in Colombia in the last 60 years of war, because our war continues in Colombia. After the peace agreement in 2016, we've seen groups that become organized. So it's not only a national threat, if there's also local threat. So this is a different sort of criminality because they exercise power over those regions. And so we see this occurs in fragile states where there's no legitimacy, as we heard in a previous presentation, where civic trust is lost. And so it's replaced by violence. And so that social violent control is political, perhaps not electoral, but you are controlling the political relationships in a community. A fundamental concept is representativeness when we talk about macrocriminality. So there's a problem based on facts, especially when we're investigating this, when we're investigating all of these crimes. Now, we cannot refer to all of them. We can't say 2,000 people died, we're going to look at every single one. Or 10 million people in Colombia were displaced in the last 40 years. We're not going to be able to look at every single one and refer to every single person and victim. In Colombia, with the law of justice and peace, we were able to demobilize paramilitary groups in 2005. And what we did is an exercise to see if we could look at every single case. And after 7 years, we said this isn't possible because there's de facto impunity. So we, through logic of human rights, we suppose or assume that everybody's going to have access to justice, every single one of these people. But it's not possible. And there's an even worse problem, because if we look at every case and every series of facts, we see what we see is that we have scapegoats. And so we have to look at where the orders come from, truly, where everything has taken root. And that's very connected with restorative justice. And so we see a case that illustrates how crime was being exercised over others. And in the sense of restorative justice, if I look at this investigation of macrocriminality, I can see the bigger picture. And so we can repair things symbolically through a message for something that should never have happened. Now, this is a model for the mixed, this is a mixed restorative retributive justice model. What we've learned is that it doesn't need to be an entirely retributive model or restorative model when it comes to macrocriminality. I'm referring to corruption here. Corruption is, in its essence, macrocriminality by the definition I've given, because it needs association. The work has to be divided. It needs to be segmented in terms of its information so that different legal paths can be forged so that things can be done illegally. I'll give you an example. The paramilitary project in Colombia wasn't just paramilitary. It was an economic, social, and political project. It was born out of this argument that we have to fight guerrillas that are kidnapping farmers who own land in Colombia, for example. But those people, they hire the army. And so with this logic of fighting against communism, well, this sort of situation expands into something else where the land is taken over by other people. And so we have the economic matters, so that basically these groups take over the land and infiltrate with their presence in the state. What we saw is that the paramilitary group took over the Congress, for example. 60 people took over the spots in Congress. And so we were able to see through this project how things work. So if land is going to be stolen, this is what happens. A massacre carries out on the farmers. Now that land that's available is bought for cheap and is legalized, and that isn't done with the army. That's done with a notary, a public notary, or a local mayor. And then when that land is purchased, it is sold to a bigger businessman who starts doing monoculture, and it cannot be sold to, or the farmers cannot access it anymore. And so this is homicide of protected people. Murders, war crimes, such as torture, etc., etc. And so what Colombia did at that time in 2005 was to have a more transactional law than something that will be transitional. The version or the story that we saw in 2016 was different. So we have this project with a community where some sort of reparation can be done to the land and to the people. For example, the loss of land also meant the loss of a cultural festival, for example. So helping them to get that festival back and still be able to celebrate that. And so this goes into the social pattern so that we can also deal with the social cultural aspects that they've lost. Cleaning mined lands as well, for example. Now, this jurisdiction for peace in Colombia isn't a court. It's not a legal court. However, we can carry out a process where perpetrators have to face the consequences. they have to face the consequences of infringing on restorative justice. The more you support victims getting their dignity back, the less punitive the consequences will be. And who do we want the truth from? Well, from the people who are most responsible, those who have carried out these actions. Now, restorative justice in a very regular context will follow this graphic. So we have victims who suffer and they receive the retribution. So the problem isn't going against the state, it's the suffering that they have endured. And Niels Christie said this as well. The idea is recovering what they lost through the conflict, which the state took, or the lawyers have taken, or a certain group has taken. So it's about transforming the conflict. Conflict isn't the issue because we all need conflict, but the problem is when it becomes violent, right? And why is conflict good? Because it reminds us of the values we have as a society. If we have an electoral conflict, for example, where values of society are at play, because conflicts are good. So remember why the United States, for example, is a Republican democracy, right? And so conflict is reminding us of those values. And so it's about the restorative idea of conflict. But it's not only about the victim receiving something through that justice, but also the perpetrator gets something. What do we want the perpetrator to get? Well, many indigenous models, for example, and we just heard about South Africa as well, there's an ethical principle. If we cannot be a community without you. So we want you to come back, integrate again. You've caused suffering. You have to face that, and then you come back into our community. And the community that has suffered, that has lost that civic trust through that interaction and that participation, it needs to recover that. And so that's the model in a regular world where we don't have huge violations of human rights, where there's not organized groups that are huge, that are committing atrocities. So what's the restorative transitional justice model? Well, it's a model where we look at everything at a higher level, like the mass of it. So the first principle that a state should address, that would like to carry out a process, is selection. It's rational and strategic. I can't look at all of them. So I have to look at the most serious cases and most representative. And with that, I want to send a message so that I can tell others what happened with in that specific case. This includes several victims from several crimes. So the result isn't individual reparation. It's probably impossible to have a material restorative justice. And so it's about a collective restorative justice that includes truth and for that not to repeat. So from a point of view of human rights, it's a little hard to understand because then not everyone is going to get something and not everybody's going to feel completely represented. And so the main challenge is how through one case we can help repair others. In Argentina, we have a case where transitional justice is seen as a discourse, right? It's not born like this really. It's born out of something punitive. We have a trial and they're processed and we can see what's happened before. But if we look at 1985, we have trials that look at very representative cases. For example, in Argentina, they only looked at 300 cases of the thousands that there were of disappeared persons. And so through that, however, others said, oh, look, this happened to me as well, and I can see myself reflected there. Now, perpetrators and grave crimes and other crimes that are carried out, they are integrated into society again. So from being a leader of war, they turn into a leader of peace. This is part of this process. And then as communities, binding what they had before so that conflict isn't violent again. for this to be comprehensive. That's what's important here. And what does the state do here? Well, for example, we can have a National Commission Against Corruption, and then there's the final purpose of restorative justice, which is the reconciliation of society after this context in which conflict, grave conflict, has been occurring. So that's the idea, to turn restorative justice into transitional justice. I'd like to now speak about crimes. The Commission doesn't address these, but there's corruption on an international level, on a mass level. Legality and illegality crosses the line. Now, when referring to the main responsible party, this is something psychological, because we don't only need criminal law, we also need social science, psychology, to understand how a group functions, looking at their actions and how those actions respond to a certain purpose. So I need to investigate through analysis and the context, right? And so what that main responsible party does through its context, which is a sequence of actions, and then there's consequences. So if I look at the purpose of a certain series of actions, I can see what crimes I can press or charges I can press against that perpetrators, and then see what they're responsible for. I'm not going to go in detail, but for example, I can translate something legally through the social analysis of it. And I'd like to conclude with this. This is the model that I'm referring to. We call it bottleneck model. And the image shows it very clearly. Let's say I have a lot of cases. I'm going to focus on representative cases, which will help me press charges and indict those responsible for that. So I'm going to look at what I'm able to, depending on the resources I have, to be able to find something more representative. And corruption, that can work very well because there's so many people involved. So, for example, what's going on with one group, and where can I find the representative person? So I have structures. I go from the top to the bottom. But what I'm really referring to here is making some cards or just points, units that are representative, and then deciding what crimes I want to, or what charges I want to press against these specific units of representative people. So we can also concentrate or focus on a group of cases that have happened in one place and one time. Because you can have, for example, 2,000 cases, and you can focus on just 3 powerful cases so that the same thing doesn't happen again. We can use patterns, as we can see here, and it doesn't have to be international crimes that we look at. It can be Guatemalan crimes. And finally, of course, this has challenges, especially in criminal culture, such as in Latin America or the United States, where we say, oh, it's the rights that belong, these are human rights that belong to everyone, but that's de facto impunity. It's an expectative that we can't comply with. And the access to justice is a problem. Restorative justice is still a big issue. How can we truly find reparation? How can we do something collectively? If a certain couple of people don't have access to sewage anymore, what can we do, right? We can have the sewage system for them again, but also acknowledge those who have suffered from this. So symbolic content is extremely important in terms of restorative justice, so that something doesn't repeat. What can we do? What will the most responsible party receive so that we can have a lasting impact on society? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gabriel. Just needing to keep thinking about time. And so thank you very much for, this has been very rich. There's multiple applications that we're hearing about. So I want to turn to our Guatemalan respondent, Daniel Haering, and ask him to give us some of his thoughts and feedback on what he believes is possible in the Guatemalan situation as he continues to advise the Commission.
Thank you, Carl. Muy honrado de
Thank you, Carl. It's an honor to be here at this panel, and it's fantastic to hear the reflections of experts here when it comes to restorative justice. What this panel has touched upon is very applicable to the situation in Guatemala without forgetting or ignoring the fact that it's going to be very difficult. We were talking about restorative justice with Mary and how to apply that to the case of Guatemala and systemic justice and things that are in place. And we were talking about how we don't know how the political class is going to react to that. As you know, by carrying out these actions towards restorative justice, it's like a complete change in the matrix or the status quo. So this is something that we have to carefully continue working on. What I'd like to say during this presentation is really completely in reference to the CNCC, the National Commission Against Corruption. We, in our arduous efforts from 2008 to 2019, were great, but our most, let's just say, like the highlight of the efforts that we've carried out started in 2014, 2015, until about 2018. Those are the 3 main years that truly changed the patterns in Guatemala. This is something we'd never seen before. President Molina even ended up in jail thanks to some of the cases that we looked at. President Molina has been in jail until just recently, or rather continues to be in jail. And later on, the entire cabinet of Molina and Colón was processed, which was the previous president. And so we saw this explosion of several criminal cases. We looked at them coherently, and this had a huge public impact. 70 to 80% of Guatemalans were supporting this process, and this opened a window of opportunity in 2006 for reforms. And again, this is just highlights corruption and how things have worked systemically. And these specific topics were at the center of also what the public was focusing on. So what happened after 2016 and 2017? Well, the CNC started to tackle all sorts of topics. We have cases that impact local leaders, the traditional political parties in Congress, the owners of parties, because we don't really have political parties there. We have owners of parties, and then cases that affect organized crime, drug trafficking, and cases that also affect the traditional oligarchy, and in a very short amount of time. So what that generated was a first round of waves where everybody just sort of gave up and do whatever people wanted. So there was Velázquez, who was a Colombian commissioner, who is now a minister of defense in Colombia. And Vasquez got to Congress during that time, and he was completely willing to pass lots of laws, because I personally was able to talk to a lot of deputies during that time. And they would say, I don't want problems with Sikik. If they want me to remove this law or to pass it, I will do that. So that was the energy and the sense of that.
So eventually realized this, and we started talking about this in 2017, and it began to keep growing, and there began to be fear in the elite economic and political classes in the country. Why? Because everyone in a corrupt system and a corrupt structural system, everyone has hidden skeletons in their closet. Everyone has something that they've done, and they begin to see that there is a fear that the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala will present big cases, and that it will become a narrative of that all of these people have been doing this. And people start to use a lot of irony and sarcasm. I've been guilty of it on more than one occasion, but this generated a state of panic among the elite, the political and economic elites. And this brought up ghosts from the armed conflict. I heard someone say that he had not had such a bad time of it since the time of the guerrilla warfare. The guerrilla warriors came from the mountains to their estates, and we've now seen the same left that has been transformed, this same left came to my house to arrest me. In a lot of different cases, we saw this, and we continue to see these cases, but they did have these ghosts, these skeletons in their closets, and these ghosts were kind of coming up in the night to wake them up, and they were afraid of it. So now we see that the CICIG has been very fragmented with regards to all these different issues, economic and political issues, among the same class of elites. But we've also seen this kind of unionizing against the commission, where certain actors who are especially aggressive in the way that they defend these policies and are especially participatory in these acts of corruption are kind of on the periphery of these corrupt actors. They've been involved in processes and they've committed acts of corruption, but they're not as serious as those who are at the center. And these people have made a pact, they call it the Pact of the Corrupt, against the International Commission. And this pact was able to get rid of President Jimmy Morales, and he ended up being involved in a much more minor case. We're talking about just a couple $1,000s. And they began a crusade against him, which was really not very productive. And all of this, what it created in the end, was that Jimmy Morales was taken out of office. He was exiled from the country. And since we've been in this process, we have experienced about 4 years since 2019 up until 2023. We've seen a lot of this persecution. I experienced it last year with my passport. There was a case that was a threat against me personally when I've had no involvement in any public activity. And this was analyzed in the communications media. So we've got 150 people who have been exiled as a result of this process. And we have seen just blatant, repulsive, repugnant corruption in my country. And I'll say it from the perspective of someone who supports and very much so supported this process, but with this strategy of going against everyone at the same time in a very aggressive way, every single corrupt actor, we have seen the 4 years of some of the worst corruption and the worst persecution, both criminal and political, in our country in the last few decades. So I think that in this context, we need to learn from that mistake, and we need to say that now that we have a new opportunity, and now that we have 3 years and 3 months to try to change the country, that we need to begin to talk about a different strategy. And I think this fits perfectly into this transitional restorative justice model. Why? Because at any given moment in 2016 or 2017, in certain parts of the elite and certain economic and political actors of the country, we saw an exodus. An exodus that was based on truth and reparations. But we saw people coming to take these people from their homes, and we saw all of this aggressive behavior, and that has kind of taken us down a different path. In the Guatemalan experience, I've had the privilege to be able to speak with a lot of different economic and political actors personally. And this is really funny, to be honest. There's kind of an irony in all of this. There are these people who are involved in this corruption are also scandalized by the corruption and know that we've seen corrupt networks over decades, and this has gotten completely out of hand. Before we would say, oh, maybe they're just taking about 10% of what they should or 40%, but now we're seeing that there is an exodus among this class of people, including highly corrupt characters who are very traditional. And I think that this is a great opportunity. So in the specific case of Guatemala, we have an attorney general who is a great defender of this process in Guatemala and is a democratic actor who goes after anyone who is a political rival, who has certain legal protections that President Arevalo is not interested in getting rid of. So we have to live with these people until May of 2025, and we have an inability to overturn the results of different elections, and this is getting smaller. So until then, we're not going to be able to have anything similar to a commission like this, but we can prepare ourselves. We can prepare our strategy so that once we see this exodus of these people and we see the end of the government of Arevalo, and we have challenges to this system where we have a lot of agents who do not want to change, we can orchestrate an exit so that we have coverage of the system and we can isolate the worst bad apples, and then we can apply this kind of justice, which has a much more jail-based nature for these people. Amid all of this, I think that we're lacking in many ways. We're lacking recognition of the problem, not just ours. We know the harm that corruption does, but in many different economic and political systems of the country. What I mean to say with this is that I believe in the use of the private sector, of traditional economic actors. But after what happened, they have sought to reverse the narrative and say that they're not guilty of anything. And unfortunately, in Washington, a lot of people believe it. We also, in order to have an endpoint to this, we need to change the rules of the game in terms of hiring, in terms of services, in terms of managing public funds, in terms of processes. So we need to recognize the problem with regards to these rules. And the big challenge that I think we have is the issue of public truth-telling. Why? Because a lot of these actors completely deny their involvement in the most ridiculous and absurd way that you can imagine. So it is the clearest example of post-truth that I can find, that some of these people who have been directly discovered with red-handed, that they're saying that, oh, I was there for another reason, that clearly we have not been involved in this, and that's not what I was doing. So I think that we need the government to change out the Attorney General. We need to have the president show himself to be very strong against the political system of Guatemala with regards to what has happened. We need to present a change in the rules of the game. We need to delineate the path forward with regards to the conversations that are going to become. Perhaps we could advance a little bit in that area. We need to develop a path of legal exits for these people from these acts of corruption. We need this so that this, up until a certain extent, I don't know that it will be the final limit, but that we are able to advance and make these reparations for these victims and focus ourselves a lot more in recovering private assets to give reparations to the victims and use jail time less. Because what the International Commission did was a lot of jail time for many powerful people, but very little recovery of assets. So there are a lot of people who have been in prison for 10 years, who continue to have money bags hidden in some hole, which is what they've used to buy impunity. And we see these great actors who are acting in corruption, who are free, who are influencing the justice system right now. And so I think that this is the opportunity until 2026 to lay out this path forward. And that is where I think that under different conditions, we can see other agents who are going to prefer this other exit plan than to continue with, oh, let's put them in the jail and then we punish them and then we put them back in jail and so on and so forth. Thank you.
I'm aware that we are over time. I'm thinking we'll take a few questions, or shall we take the break now? A few questions now? Let's open it up for some questions. So the mic is going around. Thank you to each of the panelists for their really important inputs.
Yes, thank you so much. My name is Pina Nepram, and I am advising indigenous issues here at USIP. I come from Asia, and where the conflicts that has ended in Guatemala, in Colombia, our governments learned their techniques and applied it on many of our communities here. And it's really inspiring to learn how you did in Guatemala when following the peace processes. In Guatemala, what happened? We are looking at what's happening in Colombia. But the question is right now, how do you deal with this macro criminality in the time when there is rising conflict, where there is arms flooded, narco trafficking? And I'm talking about my part of the world where I come from, which is the Indo-Burma border. It's not ending. And how do you hold, learning from examples from Colombia, from Guatemala, do you see a hope? Because I don't see one right now. Right now you're talking about, in your slides, how do you get, we are now seeing violent extremist groups perpetuated by political groups. Everyone seems to have their own criminal armed group in Asia now, in many parts of Asia that I'm closely documenting and watching. So I wanted to know, I know that your conflict is past, but there are rising conflicts now. We now live in a world of 107 conflicts. So I just wanted to know if what should be And what do you think is the future? I know you're talking about Guatemala and Colombia, but I'm worried about globally. I work in indigenous communities in more than 90 countries. And the conflict is rising. The weaponization of identities and the criminality, our democracies are criminal democracies right now. In India, there's a saying, if you're not a criminal, you will not be able to contest elections. We have 43% people with criminal background record in current government of India right now in the Indian parliament. And we are talking about the world's largest democracy. So we do remain worried while talking about the ethics since yesterday and the ethics of these commissions and the need for us to seek accountability. On the other hand, our children are growing up seeing all the wrong things done by those in power. Thank you.
Shall we take a few questions, and then I'll let the panelists pick those up. Is there another question here? Yeah. Keith.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That was really a wonderful panel and really sparked, I think, a lot of new thoughts and thinking. My question would be, first of all, excuse me, the role of international actors. Obviously, in Guatemala, CICIG was an international actor, but as you look at Daniel, as you look at things going forward, how do you see what is the essential role of international actors in helping with this process? Gabriel also, and then Fanie also, I think for you, the same question, but also I was actually a little surprised that you kind of had the limitation on restorative justice, and just wondered maybe you could elaborate a little bit on why that door is closed, and if you've been inspired by Gabriel and his articulation, and Daniel as well, maybe if you have any rethoughts on that. But why would there not be a restorative component to what you've described? And then, in general, I'm just a little bit curious in Guatemala, especially, whether there's a parallel process of I think you mentioned it, but finding where the assets are being held as part of the process for being ready. And what kind of recuperation of assets do you think is going to be possible ultimately?
One more, Mary? Yeah, oh, no, that's fine. Mike, we'll come to you too.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Wonderful interventions. Question first for Gabriel and then for Daniel. Where has the process for the HEP, you've talked about how it works in theory. I'm wondering if you could give us a couple of examples of where it works best and where it hasn't worked. What are the communities where you can use this process, and where are the communities, because of course Colombia is a vast country with very different types of communities, and where is it most challenged? And Danielle, where would you start if you wanted to start both truth-seeking and then some kind of restorative processes? Again, you've got Gabriel laid out a process of mega cases, but where would you find both truth-seeking most necessary, and where would there be greatest opportunities for restoration in Guatemala? I mean, you have corruption in the health sector, you have corruption in infrastructure. I mean, but where would you start? You've got to start somewhere.
Let's take one more. I hope you guys are taking some notes. I'll let you jump in then. Yeah.
So hi, everybody. Really interesting panel. So I had a few questions here. So Fanie, one thing that was surprising to me was that you said that you didn't want amnesty in this case, which was super interesting given the history of amnesty in South Africa. So I was hoping you could elaborate on that. And Gabriel, I was also really interested because you were saying that you should select the cases that are the most serious and that can really sort of be emblematic of something larger. But yeah, given the history of CICIG that Daniel was talking about, I don't know, at least from a professor's perspective in the academic literature, we think that maybe it's not always best to go after the worst cases. So that was a little bit puzzling to me, and it'd be interesting if you could elaborate on that. And then, yeah, those were the main points, but I thought also Jennifer brought up some nice points about the process that I think could be really useful as well. So thank you.
Wonderful. So we've got a question specifically on the what are we doing? Where does this apply when violent conflict is on the rise? And you've got political corruption and violence being propagated, and the capture of resources, etc. We've got two questions. So, Fanie, we'd love for you to talk to restorative responses or amnesty responses in the situation in South Africa. And then we've heard a number of the other questions around how do we get back the resources that we're talking about in Guatemala and help to redistribute. And where has this process worked in Colombia and where hasn't it? What are the challenges? And finally, what are the opportunities, the access points for truth-seeking and reparation-seeking efforts in Guatemala? So some of those are specifically to Guatemala and Colombia, and some are more general. Maybe we can start with Gabriel.
Thank you. Yeah, sadly, in Colombia, we cannot say that we have overcome the conflicts that are right now rising in some places in the country. Actually, there's 6 ongoing peace negotiations in Colombia right now, all of them in a difficult point. So if we have learned something about peace, is that it's about implementation, not signing a deal, an agreement. And implementation has been obviously hard because there's structural problems that continue in the country. Now, those conflicts are different anyway. And the fact that we have right now a president that is left-wing leaning, that was impossible in Colombia before this peace agreement. So that's part of the results of having these kind of discussions. But obviously, it takes time, and it takes changes that cannot be done in just 7 years. In any case, just to give you an example of what have worked a little bit, and that's referring also to Mary's question. In the agreement of 2016 with FARC, the perpetrators that are allowed to participate in the special jurisdiction for peace processes were supposed to be the military, the former FARC rebels, and what we call the third parties. These are civilians that were involved in the conflict by using corruption to get to some point in the regions. And those third parties, the Constitutional Court said, no, you cannot participate, or we cannot push you to be part of this. You have to do it voluntarily. So we thought, okay, so the big names, the people behind all these processes of stealing land, the civilians that got profit out of it, they're not going to participate. But on the contrary, this method of incentives and conditions made that a lot of people that is being investigated, or even in the ordinary system sanctioned, they were asking to be part of the HEP, to bring truth-telling in order to get the benefits, but also to explain how the political elites were part of the conflict as well. So my first idea in this complex question around the world, like conflicts are arising, and as USIP, we think about it like we need to be creative. Punitivism is not the answer. And macrocriminality with a restorative approach could be interesting in the sense of giving an incentive for those that are part of these groups to say, okay, if we're going to look for reconciliation, maybe there's a way in which we're not going to jail, all of us, but there's a way to bring some kind of response that satisfies the different actors. Right now, the conflict in Colombia is not about taking power as it was before, like a failed society, but it's regional. So it's about these powers that has in treatment trafficking of persons. They have drug dealing and illegal mining in the peripheral Colombia. So to tackle that is to give opportunities, if we understand in this kind of investigation how they work, to push them and then give them opportunities to come back. So restorative justice instead of punitivism seems to be something more interesting for those that are involved in criminality. Now, international actors in Colombia have been fundamental to, this was Keith's question, to get the standards going. So the International Criminal Court, the Inter-American system of human rights, we're always in discussion or in a constructive dialogue. I would say there's a concept that was created between the International Criminal Court and the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, and it's positive complementarity. So it's the idea that the International Criminal Court is not there as an institution waiting for you to fail, but that can work together with a country in order to satisfy the international standards of international criminal law. So that's remarkable in terms of we're not seeing the prosecutor of International Criminal Court just pushing Colombia, but actually learning from it and exchanging. So that support in a political climate is completely polarized has been helpful. Examples of the HEP that have worked. So we don't have restorative sanctions yet. And we were discussing this with Jennifer yesterday. It doesn't matter. If you actually embrace restorative justice, the sanction is a byproduct of something more important, which is the process. And we've seen in Colombia, I've seen it myself, and Carl as well, in public hearings, restorative interactions that actually bring some sort of healing to victims and perpetrators. These hearings and the preparation that come from them, 7-8 months of preparation, are actually ways of giving back to victims even prior to deciding on the restorative sanction. And in terms of criminal investigation, in Colombia, the body count policy that included extrajudicial killings, more than 6,402 young men were killed by state agents to be presented as guerrilla members in order to increase results. This that I just said, and the number that I said, that was investigated by the HEP. Before the HEP, with ordinary justice system, we just had the material authors of the crimes. Now we know it was a policy, and it's undeniable because we've seen generals acknowledging their responsibility in this criminal plan. So those are, from my point of view, remarkable results that are an example internationally that you can change the narrative even before having the sanction. So that's remarkable how they have. Now, obviously, there's complaints by human rights organizations, by victims, even by lawyers, and these are the more problematic ones, saying this restorative justice is not satisfactory and is not meeting the standards of due process. Or, I mean, there's a huge discussion right now. I wouldn't say that the HEP is doing great. They're having a lot of pressure, but they have had some landmarks that is interesting to follow. And finally, selection as a constitutional criteria of Colombia. I mean, in order to select a crime in Colombia, you need to have a constitutional reform because in ordinary justice, you need to investigate everything. You can prioritize, but you need to investigate every single case. The fact that we accepted selection as a transitional justice mechanism is about strategy. And this strategy is to say, look, it's the most serious one and the most representative one. We're looking for that one because if we go for that one, we don't need to expand our resources to try and tackle every single case. So that sends a message. I know what you were saying about like the worst case maybe is the most difficult one to get, but in terms of inductive criminal investigation, in this case that I just said, the body count policy, they started by pelotons in different regions. Just to say one main inductive argument, it's impossible that this is random. So you construct the case and you don't need those material authors to be part of the process at the end. They might get some amnesty, conditioned to tell the truth, but then if you want the sanction, you just go for the ones that should have known, which is the international standard. Yeah, omission of responsibility. So that's why you select. You just need that one, but then you show a policy, a criminal plan. So that's why the Constitutional Court has acted.
Daniel, you want to take on?
Sí. Sí, varias.
Yes, I have many things to say. What can international communities do? The international community, when we talk about Guatemala, if it has a first and last name, it would be the United States. That is what really matters. It's not that other things don't matter, other external influences don't matter, but the United States is where we have immigrants who are sending $20 million to sustain the Guatemalan economy. It's the main sphere of influence in terms of security, politicians, the United States. And in addition, Guatemala doesn't have petroleum, things that would make us more independent. So the United States has a lot of power in Guatemala. And I think that United States needs to have a lot more clarity with regard to what it can do in Guatemala, because it can do a lot. I have the sense that its only interest is just to stop the flow of immigrants, and that's it, because that's the main issue. And as we know, the United States has a lot of other problems. and cities have a lot of other problems. But when we say, okay, we're going to work on something in the mid to long term in Guatemala, and when they say, okay, what's going on in Guatemala? Again, they think, okay, we're going to save democracy, and we're just going to wash our hands of it, and we're going to move on to something else. Why do I say that? Because I have the sense that the United States, including this government, I think, and what could be a future Trump government in the region, is not aware of the problem. They don't pay attention to the problem. The question that we have to ask with the United States is, does Guatemala really have extractive interests or not? When we talk about Nobel Prize winners in economy, when we talk about the elites who have a lot of influence, these are extractive elites. So these people are receiving and often accepting the post-truth, ridiculous discourse that Guatemalan politicians are in some way the victims of an ideological persecution when they are really thieves.
So putting that pressure on them so that they can recognize their responsibility. And let's be honest, everyone who recognizes you in private cafes or who says, yes, we know that he stole this, that he's a thief, or that he's this and the other way. Well, how with this system can we create something better for the future? How can we create these legal solutions and achieve all of this? If the United States, in a bipartisan way, comes to an agreement that that's the path to take, then we can solve a lot of problems in Guatemala. But this argument that they're lost or that nothing's happening, well then, all we need is another 6 months until the same corrupt people come back and wonder, are they victims or not? And then just keep on going year after year, knocking on the door of the United States and reminding them of what's going on in Guatemala and what the social classes are like in Guatemala. I'd like to now reference something that would really help the United States and other parts of the international community, which is asset recovery. The United States, apart from the war in the Ukraine, has been focusing on looking at yachts in the middle of the Mediterranean, for example. But the Guatemalan financial system is very interconnected to the U.S. financial system. A bank in Guatemala, if it doesn't have a connection with U.S. banks, can barely operate. And the $20 billion that are sent over into Guatemala basically comes from the United States. And our currency, Guatemala, is contrasted with the dollars. There's barely anything beyond that it's compared with. If the U.S. says, let's transfer certain capacities to Guatemala so that from the superintendents of the banks where leadership can be renewed, and the government will be able to do that very soon, then from the financial interests in Guatemalan banks, there's a lot of financial interests. So let's look at that money that's been stolen, which is within the financial system that doesn't have a bank secret. I think that can help tremendously and help us recover assets. Right now we have the law of the asset forfeiture law, which is in place, and the Constitutional Court is going to want to help its buddies unless there's a change in the public ministry. But I think we can do that through that law to track that money that's been stolen and recover it so that that money, which is what's important here, is not reinvested, so that kleptocracy isn't fed by this money. We still have a lot of financial agents that have contracts with the states that are reinvesting that money so that the state can continue to be And so I think there is a lot of options here, but the United States needs to understand what the problem is here. It's not an ideological problem. It's not about using alternative tools to remove the left. Some mentioned that issue. It's about recognizing that we have a problem, which is kleptocracy, which needs to be, well, we need to fight against that. And just briefly, I think that we have a huge potential. Our executive director of the commission is very aware of this, which is the case of tax evasion, and has completely impacted our tax system. This case is under the Title 400B, which is a terrible way of naming it, but this is what led to Molina being sent to jail. And there's a huge possibility and potential here for the companies that embezzled this money to be held accountable. Because not only did they steal money, they also didn't pay taxes on them, on this money that they stole. So this is the maximum corruption. And so I do believe that this money has a lot of potential to be reinvested into public goods. Now, tax evasion specifically is usually less serious when compared to criminal cases. And yes, as was said earlier, this was a very positive process. We need to have certain paths that we can go down, but we can't do this without having big cases that we can tackle. If we do small things, small efforts, one by one, there's very little that we can change if we don't look at the political incentives that are way up there. And so we have to keep beating the dead horse. We have to keep doing it so that we can actually achieve something. If we're able to, with force, enter the public ministry and be able to achieve something, then we're, going to be able to say, okay, this is the path we have to go down. And so this way we'll be able to see how that cycle of kleptocracy is going to find a way out. I think this is one of the ways that we can make this transition.
Fanie, if he wants to respond to the two questions that were similar around the amnesty in the
yeah, thank you, Carl. If everybody can hear me, just on the question of amnesty, let there be no doubt, I remain a huge supporter of restorative justice as the notion of restoring societies, communities, individual relationships. But as Desmond Tutu himself said, if somebody steals your bicycle and he comes down the street past you on the bicycle and you say, please forgive me, and you forgive him, and then he rides off on the bicycle, you're going to ask him, please, can you return the bike as well, as saying sorry. Restorative justice is not impunity. Restorative justice is never impunity. Restorative justice is the beginning of a just relationship, as we heard right at the beginning, based on truth-telling. And I think that in South Africa's case, the conditional amnesty clause of the Truth Commission was not impunity because there were several outcomes linked to this amnesty process. The first was truth. There was a public record at the end of this. Secondly, that it facilitated prevention of these things by the implicit bargaining underneath, which removed the guns from the perpetrators. It implied return of stolen funds and stolen goods, although that has been a very delayed process, and it happened with the input of the victims. In the case of grand corruption, though, it's bad luck for our corrupt that they don't have guns, because their disruptive power is much less than the generals we had to deal with during amnesty. And I think if there was going to be out of and I heard my colleague from Guatemala speak about legal exits, or was it from Colombia? I think it's Guatemala. Daniel, who said spoke about legal exits. Legal exits, I think, are possible, i.e., legal innovations, if there's truth, a record of truth coming out of it, if it facilitates the prevention of these crimes, and if it entails the return of stolen goods, and stop the doublespeak about these things in society. Because the logic of the presentation was simply to say there is no restoration of society without truth-telling becoming a central feature, and turning the compliant political leadership and the political rhetoric that soft soaps corruption on its head. And we've heard that can come from the right and the left. And we need to turn that around in terms of a judge that has the credibility to do that, or the justice system. So for me personally, I am absolutely committed to restorative justice, but I think in the case of grand corruption in South Africa, that needs to be complemented with retributive justice for those who should have known better, namely the 1,438 people that are implicated in the Zondo Commission report. Incidentally, one further very brief comment, and that is, what can we do? Please, international community, and especially the United States, please hold your multinationals to account. The multinationals tend to come to South Africa and other African countries with the intention to bribe, because it is seen that this is the usual way of doing business there, not without some truth. But South Africa is sending a message to say no longer is that the case for us. Don't come like that to us. Baines, McKinsey's, and PwC Price Watercoopers had to settled with our tax revenue service for billions that they returned in funds that they earned through state capture. And I would urge my Guatemalan colleagues to actually follow up on that sort of procedure, to hold international companies accountable for offering bribes and for benefiting from corrupt contracts. In fact, the New York Stock Exchange fined, I think, Baines, and then one of our presidential advisors called the New York Stock Exchange and asked whether the fine could be paid over to South Africa, please, because this is our money, and it was legally not possible. But you get the idea that we think that money should come back. So this is what I think international actors can usefully do in this case. But it is the lifeblood of our nation, is a healthy political economy, and if somebody chucks this oxygen off, then we need to, as a matter of urgency, remove that blockage on our social life. Thank you.
Thank you, Fanie, very much. And I'm fully aware that we're very over time. So we're going to close now. And thank you for your patience. And we have lots to talk about. And we'll figure out we'll take a break now for 15 minutes and then come back to either this room or the other. And we'll let you know and then have a little bit more conversation. Thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists for each of your inputs, and all the best with the conversation as it continues from here.